Now we're going to begin the third chapter, where prices come from, the interaction of supply and demand. The supply and demand model is fairly simple, but it's very intuitive, and it sheds a lot of light on what's going on in an economy. So it's very useful for economists to use. In the first section of this chapter, we're going to look at the demand side of the market, so we're going to understand what's going on with consumers. In the next section, we'll explore the supply side of the market, so looking at what's going on with firms. The next section, we're going to put together supply and demand to understand what the market equilibrium is and how supply and demand interact to determine what price the goods are going to be sold at and what number of goods are going to be bought and sold on the market. In the final section, we'll look at the effect of supply and demand shifts on equilibrium. So what happens when either supply or demand curves shift and move around over time. When we analyze markets, we're going to use a simplified model, so it's not exactly what's going on in the real world, but it's close enough, and we make a few assumptions so that it's easy to work with. The model we're going to use in this chapter is a perfectly competitive market. And what we mean by a perfectly competitive market is that there's going to be many buyers and sellers in this market. So there's a lot of competition going on. Instead of just one firm or a small number of firms selling the goods, there's going to be a lot of firms selling the goods. So there's more competitive pressure on them. They need to respond to consumer needs more. Second, all firms are selling identical products. So there's no real difference between the products of one firm and another. So that way they're better substitutes for each other. Again, increasing the competitive pressure in this market. And finally, there's going to be no barriers to new firms entering the market. Again, this is competitive pressure that the firms have to face. While these assumptions are restrictive and not very realistic, the model is very useful for analyzing many markets. So now let's begin with section 3.1, the demand side of the market. In this section, we're going to list and be able to describe the variables that influence demand. We're going to begin our analysis of where prices come from investigating how buyers behave, focusing solely on the buyer side of the market. Now we refer to this as the market demand, the sum of demand from all the consumers of a given good or a service. So here, the figure on the left above is a demand schedule. Demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity of the product demanded. So for instance, at a price of $450 per smartwatch, we will see that consumers will demand 3 million smartwatches per week. Now at a price of $350, consumers will demand 5 million smartwatches per week. And at $250, consumers will demand 7 million smartwatches per week. Now, just writing out this demand schedule isn't very intuitive. It doesn't appeal to our visual senses very easily. So we can graph this on a demand curve to make it easier to work with. So a demand curve is a curve that shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity of a product demanded. And that's shown figure above on the right. So again, we have the price on the y-axis and the quantity demanded on the x-axis, and the demand curve connecting all those points that we had on our demand schedule. Now when we draw a demand curve, we assume what we refer to as ceteris paribus. Now this is Latin for all else equal. Basically what this means is that when we analyze the relationship between two variables, in this case it's going to be the price and the quantity demanded, we're going to assume that all other variables are being held constant. So when the price falls from $450 to $400, in this case the quantity demanded is going to increase from 3 million smartwatches per week to 4 million smartwatches per week. We're assuming that nothing else is changing in the market. There's nothing else going on that's causing or influencing the price and the quantity demanded that's not being represented on this graph. And the reason we do this, while obviously it's not the most realistic assumption, it's so that we can understand what's going on when there's a change in either price or quantity. Because remember, these are the two things that we're investigating, that we're trying to understand. So now when the price is $450, we say the quantity demanded of the good, in this case smartwatches, is 3 million smartwatches per week. So the definition of the quantity demanded is the amount of a good or service that a consumer is willing and able to purchase at a given price. So at that price of $450, there are 3 million smartwatches that consumers are willing and able to purchase. Now we can see from our demand graph that the demand curve slopes downward. So now the law of demand is a rule that states that if we hold everything else constant, when the price of a product falls, the quantity demanded of the product increases. And when the price of a product rises, the quantity demanded of that product will decrease. And this should be fairly intuitive. We're all consumers ourselves of many goods. When the price falls, we're willing and able to purchase more of a good. So this should make sort of intuitive sense for us. So while it makes intuitive sense for us, let's dig into what actually explains the law of demand. So when the price of a good falls, there's two different effects going on that's influencing our decision, our demand to buy more. First is that consumers are able to substitute towards good whose the price has fallen. And the second is that consumers have more purchasing power. So it's like there's an increase in your income because now goods are less costly compared to your income. So we refer to these as the substitution effect and the income effect. So substitution effect, to say more formally, is the change in the quantity demanded of a good that results from a change in the price. And this makes the good more or less expensive relative to other goods that are substitutes. So now because this good is, let's say in this example, is cheaper, the price falls, it's now cheaper relative to other goods, you're more likely to purchase that good or to purchase more of that good than similar goods or other goods that are substitutes because their price hasn't fallen. And now to the income effect. The income effect is the change in the quantity demanded of a good that results from the effect of a change in the good's price on the consumer's purchasing power. Now when the price of a good falls, it falls and your income stays the same. So it's as if your income has increased because you're now able to purchase a greater number of goods with that same amount of income. Now it's important to note that both of these effects are taking place at the same time, and it's not something we can tease out. We can say like so much of the increase in the quantity demanded is from the substitution effect and so much is from the income effect. These are just the two different things going on while our demand changes for a good after a price change. Now let's explore the variables that cause a shift in the demand curve. So change in something other than the price. So we said before that we assumed ceteris paribus, that all else was equal. In the real world, not all else is equal. So one of those other things, one of those other variables that we assumed weren't changing before, when they do change, this will cause the entire demand curve to shift. So now if the demand curve shifts to the right, so in the figure on the right here, moving from D1 to curve D2, that's going to be an increase in demand. So moving to the right is an increase in demand. Now shift to the left, in this case from D1 to D3, is going to be a decrease in demand. So now, as the demand curve shifts, the quantity demanded will change, even if the price doesn't change. So for instance, let's say we're at the initial demand curve, D1, and there's an increase in demand from a change in one of these variables. If the price remains the same at P1, we move out to the new demand curve, the quantity demand is going to increase from Q1 to Q2. So when the demand curve shifts to the right, there's an increase in demand. Even if the price stays the same, there will be an increase in the quantity demanded. Likewise, if the demand curve shifts to the left, so shifting from D1 to D3, even if the price remains the same, the quantity demanded is going to decrease. So what factors influence market demand? What are these things going on, these variables that can change and cause a shift in the demand curve? Here are the 5 major ones that we're going to talk about in this chapter. The first is income. The second is the prices of related goods. Next is tastes and preferences, population and demographics, and finally the expected future prices. And over the next several slides, we'll talk about each of these in turn. First, let's look at changes in income of consumers. So typically we would expect when a person has more money, when their income increases, that they'll be more willing and able to buy goods or services. That's going to be true for almost every good. We call these normal goods. Normal goods are, by definition, goods for which the demand increases as people's income rises and decreases as their income falls. These are pretty much any good you'll purchase. So like brand new clothing, restaurant meals, vacations, things like that. But for some small subset of goods, when people's income increases, their demand is going to go down. We refer to these as inferior goods. So some examples of these are like secondhand clothing, ramen noodles, things that consumers tend to purchase when they have very low income because they're considered low quality. And then as their income increases and they're now available or able to buy like brand new clothing or buy better food to cook at home or even go out to eat at restaurants, their demand for these types of inferior goods are going to fall. So let's explore this graphically. If there's an increase in income and there's no other changes in other variables going on, the demand for clothing is going to increase. So it'll shift from D1 to D2, moving out to the right. However, if we have the same increase in income in the market for secondhand clothing, the demand for secondhand clothing will decrease. So it'll shift to the left from D1 to D2. So we have increase in income, increasing demand for normal goods in this example, and decreasing the demand for inferior goods. The next variable that shifts demand curves is the change in the price of related goods. And again, there's two types of goods we're going to be looking at for this. First is substitute goods. Now, these are goods or services that can be used for the same purpose. So for instance, a Big Mac and a Whopper, a Ford F-150 and a Dodge Ram, jeans and khakis. These all serve the same purpose. So when consumers are trying to meet their need, they'll decide between these options. There's also complements. Complements are goods and services that are used together. So for example, Big Mac and McDonald's fries typically consumed together. Hot dogs and hot dog buns, left shoes and right shoes, if that's something you could purchase separately. So now what are the effects of changes in the price of related goods? So the demand for a good is going to increase if the price of a substitute increases. So for example, if we're looking at fast food burgers, an increase in the price of the Big Mac is going to increase the demand for Whoppers because these are competitors. So people are choosing between the two of them. So if the price of an alternate good increases, then you'll increase the purchase of that now relatively cheaper good. So using the demand curve on the right, we see it'll shift from D1 to D2 when the price of a substitute increases. Now that same increase in price of a Big Mac is going to decrease the demand for McDonald's fries because they're complements. You buy these two goods together. So because of that, the demand for McDonald's fries is going to shift to the left, move from D1 to D2. The next variable we're going to look at is changes in taste and preferences. So if consumers' tastes and their preferences change over time, they may buy more or less of a product, depending on how their tastes evolve. So for instance, if consumers become more concerned about eating healthy, they may decrease their demand for fast food. So looking at the figure on the right, the demand curve shifts from D1 to D2 to the left, because now consumers are less willing to buy fast food. It doesn't meet that need anymore because their needs have changed to preferring more healthy options rather than just getting tasty food. Now let's turn to changes in population and demographics. So obviously the size of the population is going to affect the size of the market. So the more people there are, the more potential consumers there are. But we can also break down the market by demographics. So demographics are the characteristics of a population, so things like age, race, ethnicity, gender, these sorts of things. So now a change in demographics can also change the market, especially if a good or service appeals more to a certain demographic than to another. So increases in the number of people buying something will increase the amount of demanded. So whether this is because overall population increases or because a certain demographic that likes to buy that good or service increases. So for example, an increase in the elderly population is going to increase the demand for medical care. So they'll shift the demand curve for medical care from D1 to D2, moving it out to the right. Now the final variable we're going to look at is the changes in expectations about future prices. So obviously consumers decide which products to buy, but also we decide when to buy them. If you think about it, future products can be a substitute for current products. So if there's an expected increase in prices coming tomorrow, that'll increase the demand today. And if we expect a decrease in prices tomorrow, that'll decrease the demand today. So if you found out that the price of gasoline was going to go up tomorrow, your inclination would be to go out and buy today. Buy the gas while it's still at the lower price before it increases. So that what that's going to do is shift the demand curve for gasoline today out to the right. So it'll move it from D1 to D2. Likewise, if you know there's going to be a decrease in the price of something tomorrow, you know that for sure, then you're going to wait until tomorrow to buy it. Buy it at that lower price. Give up, having that good or service for a day. So, for example, Apple has a very strict policy on product speculation. So they very strongly discourage their employees from speculating about when a new model will appear. So suppose that a customer learns a new iPad model is going to be available next month. That new model is a substitute for the current model. And we can expect the price of the current model is going to fall next month. So both of these effects, this potential substitute coming out and the expected decrease in future prices, they're both going to decrease current demand for the current iPad model that's out. And again, this is bad for Apple. Now, before we end our exploration of the demand side of the market, there is one note I want to make, and that's the difference between the terminology a change in demand versus a change in the quantity demanded. So a change in the price of a product being examined causes a movement along the demand curve. This is the change in the quantity demanded. So if you look at the figure on the right, if the price falls from $450 to $400, the quantity demanded is going to move from point A, which is 3 million smartwatches per week, to point B, which is 4 million smartwatches per week. Because this is caused, the change in the quantity demanded is caused by a change in price, we're moving along that same demand curve. Now, any other change affecting the demand causes the entire demand curve to shift. So anything other than a change in price. So let's say, for this example, the income of consumers increases. That's going to shift out the entire demand curve from D1 to D2. This is the change in demand. So we're going to move from point A in this case, at $450 per smartwatch and 3 million being sold, shift the demand curve out to the right. We're going to stay at the price of $450. We'll still move out to point C, which is 5 million smartwatches per week. So change in demand is when the entire demand curve shifts, while a change in the quantity demanded is a change in price, so we move along the initial demand curve.